Welcome back to Live Wild. I'm your host, Hilary Rose, and today I'm joined by a woman whose work is nothing short of transformative. Professor Louise Crowley, known across Ireland as the Bystander Queen, has dedicated her career to empowering people with the awareness, tools, and courage to safely intervene when they witness abuse. Louise's Bystander Intervention program has changed campuses, communities, and conversations. She teaches us that preventing harm isn't about grand heroic gestures. It's about ordinary people making conscious choices in everyday moments.
Very simply, he was in a pub and he saw a young woman. He didn't know her, but he could see that some guy was hassling her to leave with him and she looked so uncomfortable. So he said, and I can quote this bit, he said, "I'm 6'4". So I just went over and stood next to him and he scarpered like a startled dog. And that was it. He didn't say anything. He didn't, physically do anything other than go over and stand next to your man and basically say, "I see you." And off he went. And that was that. And I was so proud when he said that, because he had listened about that. You don't go over and size up to him and say, "What are you doing? Leave her alone." He simply made his presence known. And in those circumstances, that's what happened. And you see, it doesn't have to be a big hoo-ha, that it can be something very subtle.
Her work shines a light on how we can all become part of the solution. In this episode, we dive into the psychology of bystanding, the subtle ways abuse can hide in plain sight, and how each of us can build our own intervention muscle. It's powerful, practical, and genuinely life-changing work. So, settle in. This is a conversation that will stay with you. Here's Professor Louise Crowley. Professor Louise Crowley, thank you so much for joining me on the Live Well podcast today.
Thanks, Hilary. Delighted to be here.
Oh, it's so great. We met at a talk at International Women's Day, and I was really blown away by what you were speaking about. Now, obviously, you're a solicitor and a law professor, but I'm particularly interested in the work you do called Bystander Intervention. What is it and how would you describe it?
Yeah, so like you say, my full-time job is Professor of Law at UCC. I'm a professor in family law. But what was kind of a side project back in 2015, 2016 has kind of taken over my life in a really good way, which speaks to the appetite of the public for the work that I do. So back around 2016, I had this idea, well, an awareness really more than an idea, that our students and students generally, so this is not necessarily just a UCC issue, but that students who faced a traumatic incident or in particular, my focus was on sexual violence. If somebody was sexually assaulted, I wasn't very sure where they would go in a university, who they would speak to, what would happen, what would be the process, and what approach would the university take? And I asked some questions and I met with colleagues from universities across the country. And it became very apparent, sadly, that no university had a dedicated, clear policy on responding to sexual harassment and violence. And the issue kind of arose because my research is in family law and I was doing a lot of work in the area of sexual harassment and violence and the adequacy of the legal regulation. And in so doing, I was working with support services and doing some collaborative research with them. And that really got me tuned into the idea of what's happening on the ground with the law. So the law can be all very well, and it isn't perfect, but it's there in legislation. And if it's enforced well by the judiciary, it's very effective. But what happens to the human being who needs help? And I remember as a student back in the mid-90s, writing an essay on the need for separate legal representation for victims of sexual violence. And to this day, that debate is ongoing 30 years later. So it's all about considering the victim of sexual harassment and violence and how we respond to them. So I suppose for Bystander, I was very conscious of my position as an educator. And in UCC, we have in excess of 25,000 students on campus. And, the audience that I had, the way I could use my position and the power of education to open the lid on this issue and also to get the university thinking about what we can do better for our students. So in the first instance, what I did was I created a program called Bystander Intervention, very much inspired by the work of my colleague Rachel Fenton in the UK, who had created a UK toolkit called Intervention Initiative. And she said, work away with that. So hers was a much longer piece of work. So what I did was I developed a 6-week, 6 1-hour pilot, which I kind of very much Irishified the material, both in terms of the law and the culture, and then very importantly, I Corkified it. So I made it very relevant to our UCC audience. And we piloted it for 2 years with law students, and then in year 2 with nursing and midwifery and psychology students. And in fairness to the university, when I went to academic board to discuss the importance of this work, they allowed me to deliver it for credit and for it to be a mandatory requirement for progression. So the students who were engaging with this module had to attend and pass to progress to their next year of study. And that really spoke to the university's recognition of how significant this was. So the good news, after 2 years, the pilot was hugely successful. All of the students wanted this to be mandatory across the university. The feeling was, and they told me in the focus groups afterwards, that they felt that if everybody took the training, well then university, the campus would be a different space, because suddenly there would be a huge awareness of what unacceptable behavior looks like, kind of a shattering of the idea that a certain level of sexual hostility is okay. There would be a shared realization about that. And then they would also have developed the skills to support people who are vulnerable or to step in and make an intervention. So that speaks to what the training is about. It's sort of, you could say, 2 elements to it. First is educating people to better recognize what problematic behavior looks like. And that's really important, as I said, because, we all turn a blind eye to some behaviors. And I think particularly for young people, there's that social pressure of fitting in, of being kind of like everybody else and not challenging what appears to be the norm. And we know that one of the big reasons for problematic behavior is that a lot of people think, gosh, I don't like that, but everybody else seems fine, so I'll say nothing. So when they do that collectively as a group, so a class, a program, whatever it is, a football team, we go to the clubs as well, they get this chance to speak in a safe space about, actually, that isn't okay. And we talk about abstract situations which really reflect their lives, but they can be honest about them because it's not about them or their best friend or whoever. So it's that awareness piece is really critical. And then we talk about cultivating that sense of personal responsibility for the well-being of others. Because of course, as a bystander, you're not directly involved, but yet you have this sense you're triggered to support somebody or step in and challenge an attitude or behavior. And then the final element of the training is, of course, critical: what to do, what to say, who to say to, what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And that's really critical. But wow, I can tell you that at the end of every workshop, everybody knows how to make an intervention, no matter who you are. So we all intervene differently because it has to be safe for us and safe for the vulnerable person. And so depending on your gender, kind of your status and where you work, or maybe your height, all of these things play into what might be safe for you. And it's a judgment call. So we go through not only the range of what behaviors that are problematic, but also the huge range of things you can do. And people, it's a real moment for people to say, I could do that. I don't have to go in and beat somebody up. I could just remove somebody subtly, and then the danger stops. And, that's just one tiny example. So yeah, that's the training program. So it began as we transitioned to online in 2019 because of the demand. We had to scale it up for the university. And now in 2025, it's available now. We made it available to every institution in Ireland. So there are a number of universities already rolling it out, and it's in the process. It's part of the national framework to end sexual violence at third level. We've also created a staff version, conscious that staff, obviously, like all of us, have issues, staff to staff, but also staff to student or student to staff. And on top of that, then, and I can speak in a minute about the way in which it's progressed and is now externally delivered as well.
Can you give an example of what would go on in the training, like an example of inappropriate behavior?
Yeah. So what we do is in a group session. So just to be very clear, so the students do it online. There's 5 modules online. It's very interactive. So they get to write opinions anonymously in response to scenarios and questions. And then it flips on to all the other people's anonymous opinions. And that's really powerful because it gives that sense of shared norms. So I might be able to say, when I'm typing, well, this is, calling somebody, a sexy mama is actually very inappropriate and it's very intimidating for a woman. But you maybe not say that. Say, maybe I'm a guy and I say that and I think it's really inappropriate and harmful, but I might not be able to say that to my group of friends. But then when the screen flips, you see, and typically it's almost everybody has the same view, but there's a sanctity of doing it online that they can be their true self. But also then the fact that all the other views are very similar. In that moment, there's like a eureka moment where they realize, gosh, everybody doesn't think it's okay. And we know from a lot of research, and I've done it myself with my postgrads, that the good news is most people have a really decent moral compass and they know themselves. They know where the line is, but it's the fear of being the only one, or the fear of what people will think, or the fear of being rejected from the peer group is really problematic. So that's one way of developing that sense of safety. But then beyond that, we meet as a group in person then when they've completed the five modules online. And that's where you have lovely shared interaction, people across the university, different disciplines, talking about, wow, what they learned, but also how they learned what they could do. And then we go through scenarios where they say what they would do in response to problematic behavior. So to answer your question, Hilary, what might problematic behavior look like? So in the training, both in person and online, so we deliver in-person workshops to sports clubs and to external organizations. I was in with St. John's Ambulance last week, giving them a training session. So we had all of them in the room, and that's really magic because they hear each other and they learn as much from each other as from me. So I would ask them openly, I'd say, okay, in your groups, talk about, on a random Tuesday, you're coming into work or you're going to a match, what would problematic behavior look like? So I put it on them to discuss with each other what the problematic behavior might be. And then we have an open floor and they throw things out there, what could be problematic. And it's about getting them to realize that whilst obviously rape and, aggravated sexual assault is horrific and life-changing and traumatic, that sometimes we miss the other stuff, like totally unacceptable, but lower end, the microaggressions are the kind of behavior that's just how we do it around here. Like, for example, a student said to me, Louise, I was in a nightclub on Saturday night and I was groped. And I was about to tell her all about how groping is sexual assault and it's not okay. But I didn't get a chance because without batting an eyelid, she said, oh, but sure, of course I was groped. I was in a nightclub. Okay, so it's this idea that depending on your environment and who you are, that you're expected, that there's a certain level of disrespect that will happen. And it's par for the course, in some external agencies, when I would give training, and they would say, oh, you don't understand. That's how we do it around here. Oh, that's just our humor, which is sort of like a veil kind of covering this unacceptable behavior. And if you join that organization, well, you're kind of expected to go along with it. And then we become desensitized to it. So like the girl in the nightclub, she no longer saw it inappropriate that somebody grabbed her arse in the nightclub, because that's just what happens, when you go there. So it's about shattering that kind of false consensus, because it is false, that that's all okay, that we put up with that level. And that really opens people's eyes to realize those kind of, and the microaggressions that might look like something small, but actually if it keeps happening, this is a pattern of behavior, and allowing people who witness that to be more clued into it. And it means just being more aware of what's going on around you. And then when something problematic happens, you're more likely to see it, as opposed to us all having our blinkers on and living our busy lives and not being aware of what's going on for our colleagues or our friends.
When you teach intervention, what's the single most important principle you want people to remember in the heat of the moment?
Well, the golden rule is only make an intervention when it's safe to do so. So safe for you and safe for that. You do not want to escalate the situation. And so on that basis, one of the key things that people learn that surprises them is that so there's 4 Ds for bystander intervention, and one of them is delegate. That is not passing the buck. That is me going down Patrick Street tomorrow night and I see 2 fellas and they're baiting the heads off each other. I can tell you, I'm not going to jump in. Guarantee you that. Yeah. And it wouldn't be safe to do so. But what I might do is I might see a bouncer over there and say, can you do something about this? Or probably I'd ring the guards and say, there's trouble on Patrick Street. You need to get somebody here now. Because what I'm doing is I'm recognizing the fact, and you see, this is the judgment call in the moment. I'm recognizing the fact that this is not an intervention that I can personally make. I can't make a direct intervention. And so actually there's somebody better positioned to make an intervention. So that could be in the workplace. You go to HR instead of getting involved, or whatever it might be. And that's just one example of how there's such a range of things you can do in response. What if there was no guards and no bouncers? Would I kick over a wheelie bin to make a big noise so I distract? And maybe they go, oh my God, what's happening? And there's a chance for someone to run away. I don't know. You have to kind of just think in the moment, what's my capacity? And you don't do anything if it would put you in danger. Like that is so critical, because we're not training people to go out, with kung fu fighting skills. What we're saying is that, depending on the circumstances, you can do a range of things. So, I mean, to be clear, it's direct, distract, delay, and delegate. So, distract is something I think we can all use. So, maybe you're at work and there's a meeting and somebody is berating one of your colleagues, like really aggressively, and you can see it's not okay. So, you might say, come on, we'll break for 5. Or you might say, oh, Mary, there's a call there for you at the front desk. And all you're doing is removing the vulnerable person. You don't feel you have the power or the status, or you don't feel comfortable challenging whoever is behaving inappropriately. But all you can do in the moment is pull Mary out. And if you do that, there's your intervention. And that might be all you do. And the other thing I think that's really important for people to remember is that if you witness something problematic, and maybe it's somebody you know or somebody you don't know, and you don't want to get involved. So say I'm in a nightclub and I see somebody hassling a girl I don't know. And anyway, eventually it ends and she's clearly upset. But I didn't want to get involved. But what I can do afterwards is go over to her and say, listen, I don't know you, but I'm really sorry that happened. I saw what happened. Are you okay? And in that moment, what you're doing is that whilst the behavior has happened and you didn't feel safe intervening, what you're doing is you're acknowledging for her what happened. You're validating her experience. So she's not thinking, oh my God, did I give her bad vibes, or is my skirt too short, or, I kissed him last week. Maybe he thought maybe it was okay for him to approach me. No. So as a bystander, you see it and you can say, are you okay? Can I do anything for you? Can I call a friend? And that in itself is such a critical intervention and validation for somebody. Because imagine if nobody recognized it, or you're in the workplace and you're being bullied or sexually harassed and nobody says anything, even though they've seen it. And maybe they're all afraid of whoever's doing it, but you can always meet somebody after and say, God, are you okay? Do you want to go for a coffee? And that is an intervention that we can all make. So, I think that it's really important that we recognize that while safety is absolutely, the most critical point, is that we need to be conscious of the range of things that we can do.
Can you come back to the 4Ds again and repeat them, please,
Yes,
just so
course.
that we're all clear in them? Because I think it's really important, and to talk through them, each one of them, please. I know you've given a couple of examples there, but I think it actually is really helpful.
So direct is where you recognize there's problematic behavior, you hear something or you see something. And with direct, your aim is to challenge problematic attitudes and behavior with a view to letting the person know they need to do better and what better looks like. And so that's, you say something really inappropriate when I'm in a meeting and I say, Hillary, what you said there is really racist. It's unacceptable. It's contrary to our policy. You can't speak to somebody like that. That's
okay,
direct.
So that's direct.
I'm not getting personal. I'm not saying, Hillary, you're an awful this, that, and the other. I'm saying what you said wasn't okay. This is why it isn't okay. And this is why you need to do better. So you keep it on facts. Don't get personal. And your aim is to change attitudes and behavior. So that's powerful, strong, direct. But it's hard for a lot of people. It's hard to make an intervention in the first place. It's very important to acknowledge that. But also, depending on who you are, whether it's physically or status in work or hierarchy or whatever it is, that can be very difficult. And lots of people would say, oh, I could never say that in the moment. I couldn't. And that's absolutely fine. So I love direct or distract, because I think distract applies to a lot of people. So distract is basically distract, interrupt, or remove. Okay. So that is where something is happening. You don't want to challenge the person who's doing it, but you need to do something to nip it in the bud or pause it or keep people safe. So I always refer to a video that we use on the online training in UCC. It's an American video. There's very little Irish assets out there, but I will tell you in a minute about another campaign we have, which is called All Right All Night. And we've just made 4 Irish videos with Irish actors. So we're delighted in an Irish production film, but I'll come back to that. But one video we use in the online training is a US video. So it's a house party, a lot of people in their 20s, maybe 15 or 16 people in the house, and they're having beer and they're playing beer pong, all that usual stuff. And next thing, the camera pans to a man who's going up the stairs, and he's holding hands with what is clearly a really drunk young woman. Okay. And they're going up the stairs. And 2 of his buddies are up to the bedrooms, obviously, needless to say. So the 2 boys, his friends, are at the front door and they're drinking and chatting away. And they see what's going on and they kind of catch each other's eye. And next thing, Johnny is at the top of the stairs with his young woman who's very drunk. And he's just going along the landing. And one of them shouts up and says, Johnny, we're ordering pizza. What toppings would you like? So Johnny stops and looks over the banister. And while he's talking to the guy downstairs, the other guy goes up the stairs, takes her by the hand and calls her friend and says, she's really drunk. Will you take her home?
Oh, brilliant.
So nobody has shouted at Johnny and told him what they think of him. But rather what they've done is they've interrupted what was happening, because they had awareness. They had the head up. They saw what was happening and they recognized it as problematic. So then they interrupted Johnny. They distracted Johnny, they interrupted what was happening, and then they removed her. So now
Mm.
she's not going upstairs really drunk with a man into a bedroom, and she's gone off home safe. And that's wonderful. What they've done is they've nipped it in the bud, and now they're not going to have sex upstairs when she's really drunk. And that's all great. Except what's missing? Nobody has challenged Johnny. So in my head, they need to make a second part two of that video. I must write to them. And what they need to do is the three boys, let's say they work together and they're in the canteen the next morning and they're having coffee and they're a bit hungover. And the two lads say to Johnny, Johnny, what were you doing last night? You know that if you'd had sex with that woman, like she was off her head, and you can't give consent if you're so affected by alcohol or drugs. That would be statutory rape. Your life would
Wow.
be down the toilet. Come on, we're looking out for you here. Because sometimes that's what it is. It's peers calling each other out saying, listen, you got to cop on. So if they hadn't had that conversation with them, sure, he's out again tonight looking for his next drunk woman. So I think that a lot of us can do the distract, interrupt, removal piece, but the direct is really critical because otherwise, as far as Johnny's concerned, she just went home and his behavior, he will be unaware. Now, to move on to the next one, that's all very well, but are you in a position to have that follow-up conversation? You know, maybe all you can do is get her out and be done. So that's where Delegate comes in. So then, you know, you think, God, I can't say anything. But if I say to Hillary, she'll say it to him because she's good friends with him and she'll be able to have a word. So I don't think I'm in a position, maybe he wouldn't listen to me, maybe he doesn't like me, maybe I'm afraid of him, but I know he knows you well and he'd listen to you, Hillary. So I'll say, Hillary, this happened last night. I'm concerned that Johnny will do this again. Concerned for him, concerned obviously with the potential victim. Will you have a word? And then you have the direct conversation. And that's the power of Delegate, because it means you don't say, no, that's not safe for me. And Louise Crowley said, if it's not safe, don't do it. But somebody else might be in a good position to do it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the
Yeah.
last one is delay. And delay is, okay, first of all, like we're all human. We've all been in that meeting where something is said and you think, oh gosh, you're a bit uncomfortable. And I don't know if you're like me, but like 3 o'clock in the morning, a week later, I'll be lying in the bed going, that really wasn't right. That shouldn't have
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's your delay. It's not too late. I go into work tomorrow and I say, listen, Mary, I was in that meeting and I've been thinking about it and that was awful. You know, he shouldn't have said that or she shouldn't have said that. Are you okay? Okay, so there's your delay. It's not too late to support somebody ever. And then it's not too late to go to that person and have the direct conversation or delegate it to HR or delegate it to your manager. So following up is okay. It's better to do it later than never. And then the other delay piece, of course, is where someone comes to you after something has happened and says, Hillary, something terrible happened to me last week. Can I talk to you? And that's the acknowledgement piece that I'm really sorry that happened to you. It wasn't your fault. Do you want to go talk to somebody? Can I help you? Do you want to report it? Whatever you need, you know, and that's a follow-up piece sometimes, but it's really critical as well.
Mm. Is there a particular story from a participant or maybe a turning point that has stayed with you that you can share?
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously data collection and proving impact is really important to validate the program and to ensure that it is doing what I hope it will do. And the good news is that it does. So we in UCC, when you complete the training, whether you're a student or a staff member, you get a digital badge, which is the university's accreditation for non-academic work that the university believes is worthy of university credit. And so in achieving the digital badge, the students submit reflections, but also we do follow-up focus groups with them about have you used your skills? And honestly, this is what keeps me going every day, you know, what they come up with. So they're very good at going up to somebody in a pub and saying, Mary, how are you? Even though they don't know them, but they know they're in trouble and say, come on, we'll go for a drink. And that happens, you know,
Brilliant.
not irregularly, which is fantastic. And then other things, it's what's really brilliant is the young men and how they have recognized. I mean, this is powerful, and it's really important that people understand this in the whole not all men conversation, because obviously we know it's not all men commit sexual violence. In fact, it's a minority, you know, significantly a minority. What we do know is that most men have a decent moral compass. And I think giving them the awareness of what it looks like, you know, broadening that. Also, we do an impact piece. So, you know, what is it like for that person? Step into their shoes. What happens to them personally? What happens to them professionally? What happens to their colleagues? What happens to the workplace or the, you know, the classroom, the environment, you know, when all of this is going on. And then we move on to helping them to be empowered to either challenge their peers or, you know, intervene, as I've said. And boy, do they step up, and they're so proud to step up. And, you know, when we did this in person for the first 2 years in the pilot, honestly, and I delivered some of the workshops. So I watched the young men. They were first year law students. It was February, so they were in semester 2. So they kind of knew each other at this point. They socialized together. And I remember the beginning, they were kind of shocked when they heard, first of all, they didn't know why they were there or why they even wanted to be there, but it was compulsory, so they had to. And then
Yeah.
the women started sharing their stories, the young women. And honestly, you'd want to see their jaws drop. So these are young men socializing with these young women, and the young women telling them what they were going through on the same night out in the same venue as them.
Wow.
Couldn't believe it. They're literally now jaw dropping. And then they went from that, they could see them kind of getting very cross that their classmates and their friends were having these experiences. And then the beauty of it, they grew into allies, And then, so what I heard from them afterwards and the young women was that the lads were just so much more aware. They'd step in, they'd realize, what was going on. And so that was a game changer for them. And that's what I meant when they said, gosh, if everybody did this, this would be a different campus. But in terms of, I'll share a couple of testimonies from 2 young men who did the training. So one of them said, I was going home so this is me paraphrasing, obviously. I was going home from a night out. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And as I was walking down Washington Street, I saw a young woman and she was sitting on the footpath and she looked a bit upset. She was by herself. So he went over to her and he said, look, I'm not a threat, but I'm concerned. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? And she said her phone was dead and she couldn't ring her mum, who was supposed to come in and give her a lift. And he said, look, here, use my phone. He said, I'll stand over here by the wall. So to make sure you're okay until your mum comes. But I'm not a threat. I'm just here to make sure you're okay. And then eventually the mum came and the girl went away, the woman went away, and off your man went home. And he said to me afterwards, he said, Louise, if I hadn't done the training, first of all, I'd have just kept walking because I wouldn't have known what to say because maybe she'd think I was like a danger. And I also maybe mightn't have realized, the potential for danger here. And then secondly, he said, I wouldn't have known the importance of reassuring her that she was okay and that I was there to help. And so that's what he did. And whilst nothing may have happened, something terrible could have happened. And we'll never know. And I'm delighted we'll never know. But that's what he did because he was aware, he knew it was problematic, and he felt a sense of responsibility. And then he made the best intervention he could, which was brilliant. And that's really powerful. And I hear a lot of that kind of story where people see somebody and they're by themselves or maybe they're drunk and there's a few of them and they just walk the person home and then off they go on their way, And
that's incredible.
It's just so powerful.
What a different world we would have if everybody had that awareness and acted on it.
Yeah. And again, I think the piece about do what's safe for you is reassuring for people because there is that very understandable instinctive fear. If I get involved, something might happen. And that's where the judgment is really important. And then another example, which I love, and anybody who's heard me before will have heard this, but another young man who said, very simply, he was in a pub and he saw a young woman. He didn't know her, but he could see that some guy was hassling her to leave with him and she looked so uncomfortable. So he said, and I can quote this bit, he said, I'm 6'4". So I just went over and stood next to him and he scarpered like a startled dog. And that was it. He didn't say anything. He didn't, physically do anything other than go over and stand next to your man and basically say, I see you. And off he went. And that was that. And I was so proud when he said that because he had listened about that. You don't go over and size up to him and say, what are you doing? Leave her alone. He simply made his presence known. And in those circumstances, that's what happened. And you see, it's the stories like that, I think, help people realize that it doesn't have to be a big hoo-ha, that it can be something very subtle. And maybe you're on a bus and you see, and this happens too much. You see somebody being hassled, very often someone of color, or maybe somebody of the LGBTQ plus community, and they're getting grief and hassle. Even if you just catch their eye and let them know, I see you and I'm here. That's powerful. Imagine what that suddenly gives that person. You might want to stand up to whoever's doing it. It probably mightn't be safe, but you might say, will I sit next to you? Or even that. Like I wouldn't launch over and jump in next to them because, how do they know you're not a threat? But, there are subtle ways of letting somebody know that you're there and you have their back, So it can be as simple as that.
It's so powerful. Just presence and awareness, really. It's so powerful. We talk about lad culture a little bit. Where does it come from? How do you separate bonding from bullying? Because I know you did a lot of work with clubs and in, I suppose, male-dominated circles. How do you try to dismantle lad culture, but maintain the purity of it in a sense?
Yes, Absolutely. And I'm the first, I always say when I'm with, a group of men or young boys, lads are great crack. I have two
Oh,
teenagers myself. I
yeah.
mean, they're hilarious, and they're fun. And certainly my boys are kind and loving, but also absolutely bats, like great
Yeah.
crack, bouncing off each other, throwing balls at each other, everything, and that fun element of lads being together is just so lovely and so not must be encouraged. But it doesn't have to come hand in hand with, that toxic masculinity that everybody talks about. And, okay, so we're starting off in not a great place because there's a lot of it embedded already. And so that's very problematic. I mean, a huge piece is the home environment. Let's not pretend it isn't. A huge piece is the home environment. So there is something to be said for educating parents as well. And I know when I
Yeah,
worked with,
absolutely.
for example, the Defence Forces, that a lot of the men there said to me, wow, I'll be bringing a lot of this home. Thank you very much. And so I think
Beautiful.
that we need to recognize that this isn't just a single generational issue. It's a generational issue. We know that behavior can be cyclical in terms of what you see at home and what you continue. So that's kind of a separate piece, but I think it's really important we acknowledge that. And then in terms of young men, what I do know from my work is that lad culture isn't as spread as we think it is. In truth, a lot of it is, there's a lot of people go along in silence because they don't want to not go along with the crowd. Okay, so that's one issue that's there. And what is their alternative option? So we know from psychology that if there's only one voice, and even if it's a problematic voice, unless there's another option for people, they kind of, and the teenagers are hard and you're going to go with the crowd. And so what I always say to people in training is that, that we know that, the pluralistic ignorance, the idea that you're afraid to say anything because you're the only one who thinks it's not okay. We do help people realize that you're not the only one. So for example, I worked with students here in UCC, and I gave them questionnaires and asking them questions about, do you think this is problematic? What would you do here? Do you think that, a girl who wears a short skirt is partly to blame if she's raped? All those kinds of rape myths and conversations. And in fairness, most of them, I'd say about 95% came back with really positive answers. This is cross genders. And then we gave them the same surveys and asked them, well, what do you think your peers would say? All these people in the room. And it came back at about 60 to 65%. So we know for a fact that we underestimate the moral compass of our peers. Okay, we think that lad culture, those toxic thoughts, those toxic attitudes and views, whether they're racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever they are, they're not as shared as people think they are. So how do you get people into a safe space to engage with others who feel the same way? Because we know that once you give people a second option, and there's people in there, it's much easier than know that you don't have to go with these people because you have an alternative option. So I know that in the workshops, in identifying getting them to identify problematic behavior, getting them to realize the prevalence, getting them to realize the impact, it's very powerful in itself as an educational tool. Now, obviously, there are much bigger things we need to dismantle, the exposure that young men have to pornography. I mean, we know they're seeing it at 8, 9, and 10. We know they're sharing it at that age. And we know that this is cultivating their perception of what, a relationship looks like, a sexual relationship looks like. And, the problems that come from that in terms of the normalization of abuse and their inability almost to recognize where that line is because they're so exposed to behavior that is so problematic. And there's a big piece of work. I mean, there's brilliant work being done in UCD in connection with Women's Aid about how we can tackle, the technology and the big corporations that are facilitating this exposure to pornography, because that's a huge piece. But then again, having said that, pornography is in every one of their pockets, and women too. But we know that most violence comes from men, even against men. Most violence comes from men. That pornography is in all of their pockets, at all of their fingertips. So there's a fundamental shift that has to happen here, and I think the day will come where those companies, the platforms that are allowing this to happen, I really believe there will be law changes. I think there will come a day when there will have to be an intervention that will prevent this prevalence of exposure and the capacity for young people to be exposed to it. Now, also capacity of adults to be exposed to it is as problematic. But I think that if we can cultivate, obviously, this is obviously a very obvious thing to say, but if we can cultivate positive views of, intimate relationships and the fundamental idea of respect with young people, we want to introduce that zero tolerance view. And I use this example. I'm not being glib. I'm being very serious when I say this. When we brought in the smoking ban, everybody was like, oh my God, how's that going to work? And Micheál Martin brought it in. And now, I mean, as you know, you go into a pub or a nightclub, when was the last time I was in a nightclub? Anyway, and you're thinking, oh wow, it's not like it was when we were teenagers and you went to a nightclub or in your early 20s and you came home stinking of smoke. I never smoked in my life, but you'd come home, oh my God, it was disgusting. And so now if you were in a pub or a nightclub and the person next to you lit up a big dirty cigarette, like everybody would turn around and say, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because that's our norm. And what we need to get to is a place where somebody says something sexist or racist or homophobic and the whole place looks at them. What are you doing?
Yes.
Because we demand better. And we need young people, and everybody, but a lot of my work is with young people. We need young people to realize the level of respect they're entitled to. Everybody's entitled to work, play sport, study, whatever you're doing, in a respectful and safe environment. And who makes that environment? We make that environment. They talk about culture and, how do you change culture? Now, it takes time to change culture. But changing culture can only happen when behaviors change, because culture isn't what, the CEO decides the culture is of my firm. It's how all the people working in that firm behave. And you add up all of their behaviors and that equals the culture. So, we can't just sit around waiting for everybody else or somebody in power to change the culture. It's how each one of us behaves. And I think this is why education is the start of it and the end of it. Education isn't just about saying to young people, don't do this and don't do that. It's about getting them to stop and explore what's happening. Do they realize what's happening and the impact and the prevalence and how devastating it can be for an individual and how devastating it can be for the perpetrator? Their life is over. If you're Johnny who had sex with the drunk woman, statutory rape, jail. If you're 18, you'll never go on a J1, you'll never qualify as a solicitor. You'll never be a guard, and realizing the consequences of the behavior, not just obviously for the victim and the survivor, but also for the perpetrator, and to realize that it's not okay and society says it's not okay. And for young groups to be able to call out a friend and reject what they're doing. And, who wants to be that guy in a group? But so long as the silence permits them to behave that way, sure, they think they're great crack because nobody is challenging it. So I think that I always say to young men in particular, and young women, but particularly young men, it's not all men, but all men can change this. All men can be the difference and can help people realize, gosh, it doesn't have to be like this. I can go into a nightclub and nobody will touch me because people respect each other. And we all have a role to play in being part of that society, being aware, feeling responsible and challenging it. So whether it's because I'm a mother or whether it's because I'm in town and I see something, we all have a role to play. And I do think that the other thing that's really important, and this again comes back to educating parents in particular, but everybody, who's an adult. I talk to my boys about porn and consent and bystander all the time. Whether it's, if you see somebody in the yard and he's all by himself, you need to go over and say hello and say, how's it going? Are you okay? Just because of your position of privilege, because you have friends and, you have a good life. And, that's just in the social sense. And then, I do say to them, if your friends were saying something really inappropriate, they say, Mom, it's really hard. And I said, I know, but you could have a word, just the two of you afterwards, you don't have to disgrace them, and so I see it's hard, but I think it's embedding those values and those norms and, the complete unacceptability of any kind of behavior that is inappropriate and upsets somebody else. And I think that can be done and should be done. And I think, adults need to take responsibility for the way in which they can mentor young people and demonstrate through their own actions and model best behavior. We need to be very conscious of how our behavior can influence the behaviors of those who look up to us or those for whom we have responsibility. But we are in difficult times. The Andrew Tates of this world have a presence. I really don't believe they have a grip on everybody. I've spoken to young men. I'd be very involved in our GA club, and sometimes they say, who? And then they say, oh, he's such a twat. I think there's a growing awareness of how ridiculous and horrific the likes of Andrew Tate are. And we need to encourage young people to talk about that. And that's the thing, come back to education. If we can get into classrooms, and our program is in about 50 schools nationwide, and we also have a new program, remind me to tell you about that, And it's about, you have the group in the class, whether it's all girls, all boys, a mixed school, all genders, and recognizing the importance of allowing them to have that space where somebody says, let's talk about Andrew Tate. Because if we don't facilitate a safe space and a conversation and let them say what they want to say and not condemn them for it, otherwise they're only talking about it behind the shed and online and all of that. But if we give them the safe space, they lap it up and they say things afterwards in their feedback. They say, wow, that's the first time we've ever been able to have a conversation about what's really going on for us. So when we go into schools and we do train the trainer, the scenarios that we have, we don't hold back. Mary's boyfriend asked her for a picture of her boobs and she sent it, and then Johnny sent it to his buddies, and then the lad sent it everywhere. And you can kind of see them in the room thinking, but it's happening, when we do work with TY students and up generally. But a teacher said to me one day, Louise, she said, could you ever do something for our first years? Because, this was back in the first term. They're all settling in and they're a bit anxious and they want to fit in. And the girls are being asked for nudes and they're sending them because they're afraid that they'll be rejected if they don't. This is 12 and 13-year-olds. So, you see, nothing shocks me anymore because I hear this.
Probably not you, but that shocks me. Oh my God.
So the teachers are reaching out saying, can we please bring something into the classroom and we can have the conversation? The ship has sailed on porn, the ship has sailed on all of that.
Yeah.
We now need to say, this is what's happening. Our 14-year-old boys are looking at porn every night. Now we need to address it. Don't think, oh, not my Johnny, because I say to my boys, I know you see porn. I hope you're not actively looking for it. But of course they see it. It's on their on their systems. It pops up, But I do say to my nearly 14-year-old, any breasts today? He's like, Mom, But I'm always keeping it going. And they're
just keeping the conversation alive. Almost.
And keeping the communication open. And I say things like, I'm on Team Jack. I'm with you on this. If something happens, you can tell me. I might be cross and disappointed, but I'll always have your back. And it's that safety. They need that safe space because also men are vulnerable, particularly, with suicidal ideation and that fear of, I can't tell anybody, what do I do now? And so, that non-judgmental, albeit I'm very disappointed, attitude is, I think, really critical for parents and having the conversation because they know stuff we'll never know, let's be honest, the new generation. But give them the chance to talk about it, and share your ignorance, and say, look, let me know what's happening, and taking the fear out of telling you because I worry about young men and young women who, I'll tell you quickly a story about a young woman who was in that very first pilot back in 2016. So it was second semester, about February 2016. And it was her fourth workshop, I remember. And she sent me an email that night. And I remember it was about 11:30. Of course, I was on my iPad, my bad. But the email came in a big, long email. We just had the discussion about consent and rape myths and everything else. And she emailed me and she said, I finally realized today that it wasn't my fault. She had been raped at her Debs the previous September. And she was so ashamed because she had told him in advance she wasn't having sex, but she did agree to go back to a hotel room with him, but she wasn't going to have sex, and told him explicitly. And she'd had a few drinks. And next thing, they were in the hotel room and she said no, but sure, he drove on anyway. And she was very embarrassed and she felt, well, I shouldn't have gone back and I shouldn't have had those drinks. And so she told nobody. She hid her bloodied Debs dress, the back of her wardrobe, and off she went. And she carried this with her all through first semester and into second semester. And then she sent me this email and said, I realize now I never gave consent and that it was forced and that it was rape and it wasn't my fault. I actually woke my husband up and said, you have to listen to this because I can't go to bed, sleep with this in my brain by myself. Anyway, I called her in and she came in to see me, and we chatted, and then we walked over to counselling, and she got counselling, and that was February. And she came into me in the May. I can tell the story now without crying. It took me a few years. She came in the May and she said, I just wanted to tell you, Louise, that things are much better. And last night I told my mum and I told my two best friends. And so she was able to forgive herself, realize it was not her fault in any way, and she was able to share it with the people who loved her. And I just think about if she hadn't done the training, she would still probably be carrying this like 10 years later. And all those women who doubt themselves and are afraid to speak up, they need to know that they can speak up at home if they can. And if they can't, they need to know where to go for help. or if they say to a friend, so imagine you're 19 and your best friend comes to you and says she thinks she might have been raped. Like, that's really difficult for a young person to support somebody.
Yes.
But if you
Yeah.
do the training, you realize that you may not have the answers, but you have the information to say, oh, student counseling is over there. Would you like me to come with you? Or, all the different options that are there. So even as somebody who can provide supports and a pathway, there's your intervention.
It must be so emotionally draining for you. I mean, I know obviously for the victims involved, it's absolutely horrendous. But when you're dealing with this stuff, it must be very, very emotionally draining for you. How do you balance hope with realism when you're working in environments where the change feels slow or like sometimes
Yeah.
it's going backwards?
Yeah, and that's so true. The rates of sexual violence, the rates of femicide are devastating and heartbreaking, and you're at home and next thing the news comes on and there's another dead woman and then
Yeah.
there's another, like after Christmas, every other day there was an announcement and it's horrific. But all I can
Mm.
do is just do what I do. I just do a tiny piece. And
Mm.
all I can do is give, particularly young people, but I now work with external organisations, private industry, the art sector. I've worked with the Irish Medical Organisation, the Law Society trainees. I do work in Northern Ireland in Stormont with their Ending Violence Against Women strategy. And I spent 9 months with the Defence Forces last year. And all I can do is get up every day and, work on the training, develop new programs, reach new people, and do a lot of our work now is train the trainer. So if you want to maximize your reach, you get other people to deliver the training. So our
Brilliant.
newest campaign is, if you can see this, it's All Right All Night. No, you can't see it.
No, I
All Right
can't
All
see it.
Night.
No.
So
Okay.
this is a
All right, all
campaign,
night.
campaign for 16 to 24-year-olds. And it's about keeping yourself safe and keeping others safe in the nighttime economy. So it's in response to a lot of feedback in focus groups with the nighttime economy unit in the Department of Tourism and Culture and Gaeilge Media, Arts and Sport. They did work with young people, and the biggest thing stopping them going out at night was safety. Not surprising. And they've
Mm-hmm.
specifically called for bystander training. They said, we want to be able to mind ourselves, but also help our friends or help strangers who we can see are in difficulty. So we were approached by the department and we developed All Right, All Night. And so we piloted it. We're great for the pilots. Piloted it for 18 months. I did training in J clubs and rugby clubs with groups of like 30, all genders, 16 to 24-year-olds. And also we trained the trainer to teachers in Dublin, Limerick, Galway, Cork, and gave them the full toolkit, which is for school, it's 6 40-minute workshops with the full toolkit and in-person training. And then we give a teacher's manual, which goes through every slide just to really support the teacher, because it can be uncomfortable and challenging. And we anticipate questions and we support them in the manual with that. And then the sports one is 3 hours and it's in person. And the data from the pilot was so powerful. And it's about, again, helping people realize the dangers in the nighttime economy, recognize them better, recognize the vulnerability of people in the nighttime economy, and knowing what you can do in the nighttime economy. So we just 2 weeks ago launched with the minister an online version. So we've developed a 1 hour online training. It's free for 18 to 24-year-olds. It has to be 18 because of the consent issue. And it's on the allrightallnight.ie website. We have it here on the UCC platform. And it's 1 hour. You do it self-directed and you get a certificate of completion. And it's a way for us, so as well as training the teachers and now training the sports clubs and the youth club leaders and the scout leaders to deliver it in person, you can also, as a young person, 18 to 24, log on to allrightallnight.ie and start the training. It takes an hour and it is the nutshell basically of the All Night All Right training, and it's available. We have 5,000 places initially, free for anyone to take up.
That is incredible. And
Yeah.
we'll put all those links in the show
Thank
notes
you.
as a podcast as well. So if anyone's looking for any of that information, that they can just go into the show notes on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you're listening, and click those links and get stuck into themselves.
And also just to say that teachers, youth club leaders, sports leaders, volunteers can contact us and get the toolkit for their group of young people. And that way we can sustain it, because they may have, say the minor footballers this year and the LGFA footballers, and they deliver it. And then next year, the year after, they can deliver it again to the next cohort. So it can become something that, in a number of years, everyone of a certain age in the club has done it.
Yeah, it's part of the club system.
Yes, absolutely.
Louise, I could talk to you all day. I think the work you're doing is phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming on. I just want to ask you, if your younger self, Louise, starting out in law, could see you now, what would she be most proud of?
Um, I'm so proud of the work that I'm doing. You know, I thought I was going to become a solicitor. I did it briefly. It wasn't for me. I love writing books and teaching. But what I really love is I'm so proud that I have used my platform in UCC for this work. So this was just an idea I had, and I spoke to a few people, and it started, and it has absolutely snowballed. And I have I'm very lucky. I have this platform where I can reach so many people. It began as 25,000, then it was the staff, that's 28,000. But now it's potentially every third level student in the country and a significant number of second level. And then all the workplaces where I go in, and we go beyond sexual violence, and we talk about racism and bullying and sexism and ableism and homophobia. And it starts the most incredible conversations. It really does. And I know that after a workshop, I've planted seeds, and I get feedback afterwards about culture change in the organization. And I'm really proud that little old me can, go into a firm or go into a school and help people to have the skills and the words and the language and the understanding to do better and help others do better. So yeah, just so delighted. And UCC, to be fair, has been so supportive. I do actually have a full-time job as a professor of law, which is totally like the other part of my life. But, I've been hugely supported to keep this going. And it's been really good for the university as well.
It's amazing. You're a powerhouse.
Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you for coming on today. So look, Live Wild, the podcast, I always have a Live Wild quick fire round. Okay. Are you ready for your quick fire round?
Go for it.
Okay. What do you stand for?
Respect.
Beautiful. If you were to distill yourself down to an essence, what would that essence be?
Gosh. Is kindness a bit naff? Is that an essence?
No, it's not naff.
But is it an essence? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by an essence.
Yeah. So, some people say different things. Somebody said cheese.
Okay.
Once.
I won't say wine.
Yeah. Somebody said gin. Somebody said rosemary. It can be anything, or it can be kindness.
No, I can have an essence. What would I be? I think I love fruit juice.
Fruit juice. There we go. What is the wildest thing you've ever done?
I'm very tame. What's the wildest thing I've ever done? I went to Russia in 1995 with my friend Kathy, and that was pretty wild.
Wow.
Back in the day. Yeah, it was such an adventure. It was crazy, but brilliant. Wow. Like real old Russia.
Yeah. Wow. If that Russia in the 90s must have been a very interesting place to be.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you do every day to help you live wild and free?
I'm actually going to say shower.
Yeah. Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Professor Louise Crowley, you are just, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's really important. I hope that we can spread it on the Live Wild podcast as well.
That'd be great.
And like I said, any information that people need or want about this type of work, we're going to put it all in the show notes and direct it back to you guys.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for the opportunity, Hilary. It's great to chat.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Live Wild. If you enjoyed our conversation, make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who might need it today. If you'd like to go deeper, you'll find all my work over at hilaryrose.ie. From keynote speaking and corporate facilitation to one-to-one consultants and pick my brains sessions, to upcoming workshops, events, and everything happening in the Live Wild community. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for professional, medical, or therapeutic advice. Thank you for being here. Stay curious, stay courageous, and as always, live wild.